It happened 3 months after my 72nd birthday. I'd spent most of my life building something I could pass down, something solid, something with legacy. The kind of legacy you don't just leave in a dusty lockbox or scrawl across a nameplate. No, this was real. A vineyard I bought in my late 30s when I still had color in my beard and dreams too big for a Manhattan townhouse. It started as nothing more than a sunburned patch of land, and a second mortgage I didn't tell my wife about until it was too late to back out. But I turned it into something. A living, breathing place. Generations of soil pressed into bottles that sat on shelves in restaurants across Europe. We made wine that tasted like stories. And I'd always hoped I'd get to hand those stories off to someone who truly understood what they meant. My name is Benjamin, by the way. Most just call me Ben. And I guess you could say I'm the kind of old man people assume has everything figured out. But the truth is, when you get older, you start to question everything you thought was solid. People surprise you. Sometimes in the best ways, but more often, in ways that make your stomach drop. I have one daughter, Ella. She was always the artistic one in the family. Sensitive, bright, full of color and contradiction. She painted murals on her bedroom walls with acrylics when she was 14, cut her own hair the week before prom just because she wanted to feel something different, and cried when she saw the grapevines bloom for the first time after a dry winter. I always thought she'd inherit the vineyard. Not because she was entitled to it, but because she felt it. She saw the land the way I saw it. Or so I thought. Then came Dylan, the son-in-law. From the first handshake, I knew something was off. He smiled too much. Not in the warm, easy way you do when you're just genuinely glad to be somewhere, but in that overdone, always calculating way that never quite touches the eyes. The kind of smile you wear like armor. Dylan worked in finance. Real estate, I think. Or maybe mergers. To be honest, it changed every time he talked about it. He was one of those guys who always said he was between projects, but somehow drove a newer car than me and wore watches I'd only seen on magazine covers. I didn't say anything at first. Ella loved him, and he was polite. Too polite, if I'm honest. The kind of man who always called me sir, even after I told him to stop. Things started to shift slowly. First, it was little remarks at family dinners. Subtle digs at how quaint the vineyard was. How I should consider diversifying my portfolio before the market got too volatile. I brushed it off. He was young, arrogant. I'd met his type before and figured time would humble him. But time didn't humble Dylan. It fed him. Ella changed too. She stopped visiting the vineyard as much. When they did come, she seemed distracted, glued to her phone, quick to defend Dylan when he questioned the business or suggested I sell part of the land to free up some capital. I told myself she was just overwhelmed. Maybe work was getting to her. Maybe they were trying for a baby and didn't want to say anything yet. That was my way of avoiding the truth, I think. Because the truth was too bitter to swallow. About 6 months ago, I decided to revise my will. Not because I was sick or anything, though Dylan liked to joke that I was finally slowing down. No, I just felt a shift in the air. The kind you feel before a storm. And I wanted to make sure everything was airtight before the lightning hit. I made some changes. Quietly, deliberately. My lawyer, Agnes, helped me tighten it all up. I put protections in place, things that would only trigger under specific circumstances. It was complicated, and I made sure not to mention it to anyone, especially not Ella or Dylan. But I did something else too, something I'd never done before. I installed a camera inside the wine cabinet. Not for security, exactly. We already had cameras at the gates and near the cellar entrances. This one was different. Hidden. Discreet. I'd had a weird feeling ever since Dylan asked, casually, over lunch one day, about my personal reserves. The private stock. The bottles I didn't sell. The ones I made just for family. The vintages I only brought out on very special occasions. It stuck with me. So I had the cabinet rigged with a tiny pinhole camera, motion activated, loop recording, cloud synced. I didn't expect to ever need it, but I slept better knowing it was there. Which brings us to last week. I'd finalized the will. Everything was locked in. No more edits. No more doubts. And to mark the occasion, I decided to invite Ella and Dylan for dinner. Just the three of us. No staff, no distractions. Just a quiet evening in the old dining room, surrounded by wine-soaked walls and memories older than Ella herself. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could reconnect with her. Strip away the noise and the surface smiles and reach the daughter I used to know. Dinner started out normal enough. Dylan brought a bottle of red. I told him we wouldn't need it. I had something better. He didn't argue, just smiled wide and nodded like he always did. I stepped away to grab a specific vintage, something from the 90s, back when Ella used to run barefoot through the fields and ask me endless questions about the fermentation process. It was sentimental. I thought it might bring her back for a moment, help her remember. When I returned, Dylan and Ella were whispering. She looked startled for a split second when she saw me, then smiled too quickly. Dylan stood up, offered to help pour, and I politely declined. I always pour. We sat. We drank. We talked about nothing. And then, halfway through the meal, Dylan raised his glass with that too wide grin and said it. "It's so great you're finally slowing down, Ben." I felt it in my chest. The phrasing, the tone, the implication. Ella nodded, eyes darting to mine, then down to her plate. That was when I felt it, deep, low, unmistakable. Something was wrong. I excused myself, said I needed to check on the dessert. But I didn't go to the kitchen. I stepped into the study and pulled out my tablet, logged into the cloud feed. The camera had picked up everything. The moment I left the room, Dylan had gone to the cabinet, unlocked it without hesitation. Ella had stood watch. He pulled out my vintage bottle, examined it, smiled, then slipped it into his coat, replaced it with a nearly identical bottle, but it wasn't mine. The label was forged, sloppily, probably purchased from one of those boutique imitation shops that sell collector's blends to idiots who want to feel cultured. I stood there for a moment, staring at the footage. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I just felt cold. Not angry. Not even surprised. Just hollow. I returned to the dining room with a smile on my face. Sat down. Lifted my glass. "Funny," I said, slowly, watching both of them carefully. "That vintage doesn't go to anyone in the will." They froze. Ella's face turned pale. Dylan blinked. Just once. Neither of them reached for their glasses again. And that's where it really began. You see, I didn't just change the will. I changed everything. There's a funny thing that happens when you catch someone red-handed but don't call them out right away. You become something else in their eyes, not just a father or a father-in-law. You become unpredictable. And people like Dylan, they hate that, because they can't control what they can't anticipate. After that dinner, the mood shifted, but no one said a word about it. Not then. Not for days. Ella texted me 2 days later. Just a short message. "Thanks for dinner. It was really nice seeing you. Let's do it again soon." I stared at it for a while, thumbs hovering. I typed a dozen different responses, deleted each one. Eventually, I just wrote, "Always." And that was that. For the next few weeks, things seemed calm on the surface. They still came by the house occasionally, though always together, and never without some kind of excuse to pop in. A signature needed. A financial question. A new estate agent Dylan was just dying to introduce me to. That last one nearly made me laugh. I started keeping a log. Every visit, every comment, every request. Dylan had started hinting about retirement homes. Lightly at first, like he was just worried about me. "You ever think about downsizing, Ben?" he'd asked one day while standing on the balcony, looking out over the vineyard. "Big place like this. I mean, you're not exactly running up and down the rows anymore." I just smiled. Not yet. Still got a few miles in me. But the questions became more frequent, more pointed. "You ever talk to Ella about what she'd do if she inherited the vineyard? You've got some valuable land here. Have you considered, unlocking that potential before it gets passed down?" And my favorite, "You ever wonder if maybe you're holding on a little too tight?" He said that one while uncorking a bottle I hadn't given him permission to touch. Ella had already walked off, distracted by a phone call, though I noticed she didn't bother lowering her voice when she said, "Yeah, he's still being stubborn." Still being stubborn. I started to see the pattern more clearly then. I think part of me had always wanted to believe that Ella was just swept up, caught in Dylan's orbit. But that excuse was wearing thin. She wasn't a teenager. She wasn't confused. She was complicit. The worst part? I still missed her. Even when she was right in front of me, standing in the house she was raised in, I missed the girl who used to sneak into my office after hours just to sketch the wine press. The one who used to ask if the grapes felt pain when we crushed them. That version of her had evaporated. Or maybe it had been bottled up so tightly by Dylan's influence that there was no cork strong enough to let it out again. Then came the fundraiser. It was hosted by a mutual family friend, a big gala-style event, tuxedos and overpriced catering, a chance to raise money for a children's hospital expansion. Ella and Dylan were there, Of course. Flashy as ever. Dylan in a suit that probably cost more than the average car payment. Ella in a gold dress that shimmered every time she moved. They made a beautiful couple. That was part of the problem. They always looked better than they behaved. I hadn't planned to attend, but my name was on the donor list, and it felt rude not to show. I figured I'd make an appearance, shake some hands, then disappear before dessert. But fate had other plans. Midway through the evening, as I was making small talk with a board member about sustainable irrigation, Dylan walked up and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Ben," he said, too loud, like he wanted people to hear. "We were just talking about you." I turned. Ella stood behind him, holding a glass of champagne, nodding a little too eagerly. Her smile was brittle. "Oh," I asked, keeping my expression neutral. "Yeah," Dylan continued, turning to the group we'd both just interrupted. "We were telling them how you're finally letting go of some responsibilities. Taking it easy." There it was again. That same phrase. Letting go. I forced a chuckle. News to me. That got a few polite laughs from the group, but Dylan didn't back down. Instead, he stepped in closer, dropped his voice low. "Ella said you've been reviewing the trust," he said. "Just wanted to make sure we're on the same page. It's important that the transition is smooth when the time comes." I blinked. "What transition?" Dylan paused, just for a second, but I caught it. That flicker of irritation. "You know," he said carefully, "when the estate changes hands." Eventually, I echoed, sipping my drink. "Sure, but I wouldn't hold your breath." He laughed, but there was no humor in it, just teeth. And that was the moment I knew. Without a doubt, he thought it was already his. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went into the cellar. Not the main one, where we kept the bottles for events or sales or clients. The private one. The one only I had the key to. I opened the old ledger. The one with handwritten notes dating back to the year I bought the property. I flipped past decades of entries until I found what I was looking for. An unfinished note, scribbled in my own writing, dated a year after Ella's birth. Ella's blend. 2042. Only when she's ready. It was circled, underlined, and forgotten. Until now. I ran my fingers over the paper and felt something crack inside me. They weren't just trying to inherit. They were trying to erase me before I was even gone. I didn't say anything to Ella directly after that. I wanted to. I thought about calling her, inviting her to lunch, just the two of us, no Dylan. But the timing never felt right. And then, she made the first move. She came by the house unannounced. Said she missed me. Brought a bottle of wine. Not one of ours. "It's a new vineyard Dylan's interested in," she said as she poured 2 glasses. "He thinks it might be worth investing." I tasted it. It was bitter. Lifeless. "He wants to replace ours with this?" I asked. Ella didn't answer. She just looked down. That's when I noticed the papers in her bag. They were sticking out just enough for me to catch the letterhead. Real estate transfer documents. I didn't say anything then. Just tucked the information away, locked it in the same place I kept the camera footage, the ledger, and my growing list of suspicions. But the breaking point? That came a week later. I was in town, running errands, when I bumped into Agnes, my lawyer. She looked puzzled. "Ben," she said, hesitating. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Why not?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Well," she said slowly, "Ella told me you were sick, that you'd taken a bad fall. She said you were resting and asked if we could expedite the asset summary." My mouth went dry. "I took a bad fall," I repeated. Agnes nodded. She seemed really concerned. Said Dylan was handling most of the affairs for now. I thanked her, made up an excuse about needing to check on the car. Then I walked out of that office feeling like the air had been knocked out of me. That was the final crack. The moment the glass finally shattered. They were preparing for something, and they were hoping I wouldn't be conscious to notice. That night, I checked the security logs, the private feed, the wine cabinet camera, the cellar motion sensor, the backup gate logs. There it was. 2 days earlier. 1:13 a.m. Dylan, alone, entering through the east service gate. I watched the footage frame by frame. He had a flashlight. He went into the cellar. He tried my key. It didn't work. He left 5 minutes later. And that was when I knew it wasn't just greed anymore. It was premeditated, calculated. They weren't waiting for me to hand things over. They were preparing for the moment I couldn't fight back. And I had to act before that moment arrived. But not in anger. No, something much better. It's strange, really, how a single moment can tilt your entire world off its axis. 1 minute, You're the patriarch of a legacy you built from your own blistered hands. The next, you're standing alone in your cellar, watching footage of the man your daughter married trying to steal that legacy in the dead of night, while she fabricates stories about your health to your own lawyer. That's what broke me. Not the lies, not the greed, but her silence. When you've spent your life growing things, grapes, businesses, relationships, you start to believe that if you just tend to them with enough care, enough patience, they'll never rot. But I'd been wrong. You can nurture something for years and still find worms in the roots. The morning after I saw Dylan on that footage, I couldn't get out of bed. Not out of laziness or illness. I was just done. I stared at the ceiling for hours, tracing the same crack in the plaster with my eyes like it was a map to someplace else. I didn't answer calls, didn't return texts. I ignored the staff knocking to ask if I'd like breakfast. And when I finally moved, it wasn't to shower or eat. It was to pack a small bag and disappear. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not Agnes. Not the vineyard manager. Not even Marie, my housekeeper of 20 years who noticed everything and always left extra coffee grounds by the machine just in case. I simply left a note on the kitchen counter that said, "Don't worry, I'll be back." And then I drove 6 hours west to a cabin I hadn't visited in over a decade. It was one of those quiet, nameless places tucked into the woods, once used for supplier retreats and harvest offsites before we grew too big for nostalgia. I still had the key, still remembered how the door creaked and the kitchen faucet dripped unless you angled it just right. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just silence. And that's what I needed. For 3 days, I barely spoke aloud. I split logs and burned them, cooked simple food over the stove, sat on the porch with a cup of coffee that cooled too fast in the mountain air. And I thought about everything, about Ella, and how I used to carry her on my shoulders through the fields in spring when the vines were only starting to whisper green again. About Dylan, and how his name didn't even come up until 2 years into Ella dating him because she knew, somehow, she knew I wouldn't like him. About my wife, gone nearly 15 years now, and how she used to press her cheek to my chest and say, "Whatever happens, Ben, make sure this place outlives us." I sat with all of it and let it hurt. That was the fall. But something strange happened after the hurt passed. I felt light. Not happy. Not yet. But weightless. As if, for the first time in years, I wasn't pretending everything was fine. When I came back from the cabin, I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove to a small bistro in a nearby town. One that used to buy our wine before the bigger restaurants crowded them out. It was a humble place. Brick walls, handwritten menus, a woman named Nadia behind the bar who still remembered my face. "Benjamin," she asked, blinking as I walked in. "You haven't aged a day." I laughed. "You've gotten worse at lying." We talked for an hour. She told me how the bistro had struggled during lockdowns, how they'd stopped carrying our wine years ago because they couldn't afford the wholesale minimums anymore. I asked if she still wanted to. She blinked again. "You serious?" I nodded. That night, I made calls. Not to lawyers, not to board members, but to old friends, former employees, distributors we'd let go when we scaled up and outsourced to brokers. I started sketching out a new plan. Not for the vineyard. For myself. The vineyard would survive. It always had. But I needed something separate. Something Dylan couldn't sniff out or sink his teeth into. Something I didn't have to pretend to share. Over the next few weeks, while I played the role of the ailing old man at home, limping a little more when Ella visited, letting Dylan ramble about exit strategies, I was building something under their noses. A second label. A private blend. Only a few hundred bottles per year. No marketing. No distribution chains. Just word of mouth, hand-picked partners, small batch excellence. Artisan level. Experimental even. I named it Coda. A musical term. It means the end of a movement. The final passage. But also, the beginning of a new one. I kept it quiet. Filed the LLC under an old business entity I hadn't touched in years. Registered everything under a P.O. box in a neighboring state. Paid the designers and bottlers directly, in cash when possible. I even set up a private seller-off property in a storage facility 5 towns over. Just concrete walls, a cooling system, and shelves that would soon hold bottles unlike anything I'd ever made before. And it felt good. Not just because it was mine, but because it reminded me who I was before I became Ella's dad, or the vineyard guy, or that old man with too much land. I was Benjamin, and I still had more to make. Back home, I kept up the act. Let Dylan think I was slowing down. Let Ella believe I was softening. They visited more frequently now, likely worried the window was closing faster than they planned. Dylan started asking more probing questions about backup accounts, key locations, how to handle the transition when the time comes. I gave him just enough to chew on. Meanwhile, I quietly removed him from everything. The board, the succession clause, the land deed transfer. I had Agnes revise the will again, this time in airtight legalese, with clauses that would activate only under specific conditions. I replaced the trustees with longtime friends, moved the vineyard into a protected trust that excluded in-laws from any controlling interest. Even if I dropped dead tomorrow, Dylan wouldn't get a single vine. But I didn't just want to cut him out. I wanted him to realize, slowly, painfully, that he'd never been in. That's where the second phase of the rise began. I started attending events again, quietly at first. Private tastings, boutique culinary festivals, not as the founder of the vineyard, but as someone new, a curious guest, a man with stories and opinions, yes, but not status. And people noticed. They liked the mystery. They leaned in when I spoke. And when I shared a sample of coda, just a taste, poured into unmarked glasses, they lit up. This is yours. Who made this? Where can I get more? I smiled each time and said, not available to the public yet. Word spread faster than I expected. Nadia's Bistro had a wait list for a single bottle. A sommelier in Prague emailed my business address, asking for 6 cases, sight unseen. And through it all, I stayed invisible. Meanwhile, Dylan grew more visible. He started showing up at winery meetings, tossing around big words, talking over people. Tried to implement efficiency programs that confused the staff. Once, he tried to push a bulk deal with a mass-market distributor. I let him go through the whole pitch in front of the board, nodding like a doddering old man, only to say at the end, "Well, think about it," and then ignore it completely. He didn't like that. Ella, meanwhile, kept her distance. I could see it in her eyes. The guilt, the confusion, maybe even the fear that she'd picked the wrong side. But she said nothing. Not yet. Her silence still said everything I needed to know. Until one day, I caught her in the cellar. Not the private one, just the old main room. She was holding the ledger, the same one I'd reopened after all those years. She flipped to the same page. Ella's blend. She looked up when she saw me. "I forgot about this," she said softly. I didn't. She closed the book, tapped her fingers against the leather spine. Was it ever real? What? This place. The idea that it would be mine. I didn't answer. She nodded slowly. Thought so. And then she left. No tears. No confrontation. Just that. And maybe that was worse. Because I didn't know what she meant by was. That night, I stood in the vineyard just before sunset, watching the light paint the vines in gold and copper. And I realized something. Maybe you can't stop people from becoming who they are, but you can stop them from taking who you are. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Because while they were busy planning their takeover, I was setting the stage for the show of a lifetime. And the curtain was about to rise. All I needed was the perfect moment. Revenge, when it's loud and fast, usually burns itself out. But when it's slow, when it's aged, distilled, and bottled like fine wine, it doesn't just sting. It stains. That's what I realized in those quiet days after Ella left the cellar. Her question, was it ever real? Still echoed through my head, not because it hurt, but because of how quietly she said it. Like she already knew the answer, and just wanted to hear me say it out loud. But I didn't. I wouldn't. Not yet. Because now, it was time for the setup. If you ever want to learn how much power people think they have over you, pretend you're weak. Limp a little. Miss a meeting. Let your eyes drift during conversations. Give them a taste of your absence, and they'll start practicing their speech for your eulogy, while quietly circling your legacy like vultures on a dying branch. That's what Dylan was doing now, and I fed him just enough rope to tighten his own noose. I began attending board meetings less frequently. When I did show up, I'd pretend to fumble with numbers. Let Dylan explain things. Nod like I was grateful for his help. Agnes, my lawyer, caught on immediately. After one meeting where Dylan suggested we streamline operations by laying off half the vineyard's seasonal workers, she pulled me aside in the hallway. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ben," she said, her arms crossed, voice low. "Games are only dangerous if you lose," I replied. "And I've already played mine." But it wasn't just about Dylan anymore. It was about the people who worked for me, people who'd been with me for decades. The ones who remembered when Ella used to run through the rows in her rain boots, and when my wife would bring them lemonade during long harvest days. I wouldn't let that history be erased by a man who thought good wine came from mergers and Google reviews. So I started building my team. First, there was Javier, my vineyard foreman. He'd been with me since the first vines were planted. His knees were shot and his back was a roadmap of labor, but his hands still knew when the grapes were ready just by touch. I invited him to lunch at the edge of the estate one afternoon, away from cameras, away from ears. "You ever think about running this place without me?" I asked. He chuckled. "You dying?" "No, just changing the locks." He didn't ask more, just nodded and said, "Whatever you need." Next came Marie, my housekeeper. Quiet, observant Marie, who never said much but always knew everything. I found her in the kitchen dusting the top of the cabinets, a spot no one ever saw, and handed her a slip of paper. "What's this?" she asked. "A second phone. Use it if anyone starts asking questions about me. Especially Ella. Especially Dylan." She looked at me for a long moment, eyes narrowing. "They did something, didn't they?" "They tried," I said simply. She folded the paper, tucked it into her apron, and went back to dusting. By the end of the week, I'd looped in 6 more people, discreetly, carefully. All of them people Dylan would never suspect. The irrigation technician, the night shift security guard, a sommelier I once mentored who now worked at one of the top restaurants in Paris. Each of them had a role to play. None of them knew the full picture. But that was by design. The next piece of the puzzle was the wine. Not the vineyard's public collection. Not even my private cellar. The blend. Years ago, I started experimenting with a series of small batch, complex wines I never released. Too bold. Too niche. Too personal. They didn't fit the brand, but they were mine. Bottled in plain glass. Unmarked except for a faint symbol etched into the base. I never told anyone what it meant. I stored them in a temperature-controlled storage facility 40 miles away under a different name. One of my old aliases from when I used to enter amateur competitions just for the fun of it. That wine, those bottles, were the key. I sent a sample to 3 exclusive sommeliers under the guise of a new underground label. Word spread quickly. I didn't need critics or articles, just whispers. That's how the best wine makes its name. Not through billboards, but through candlelit dinners and one raised eyebrow after the first sip. Soon, collectors were asking about it. Coda, they called it. The ghost blend. I let the rumors grow. Some said it came from an elusive French artisan. Others swore it was connected to a lost vineyard in Tuscany. No one knew the truth. And that was the point. Because while Dylan was busy trying to sell off assets under the table, shady bulk deals that he thought I wouldn't notice, I was turning my personal project into a phenomenon. But I didn't want to just expose him. I wanted to isolate him. So I gave him what he wanted most: access. I had Agnes send him a document titled Provisional Succession Pathway, a fancy name for a decoy. It outlined a fake plan where Dylan would eventually take over certain vineyard operations. Carefully worded, legally meaningless, but just enough to make him feel like the finish line was near. He took the bait. He began showing up more, talking louder, giving orders, rearranging staff schedules without consulting anyone. I let it happen. Every time he overstepped, I made a note. Every time he threatened someone or dismissed a worker's concerns, I logged it. Even had Marie quietly record a few of his rants on her phone. Nothing illegal, just enough to show who he really was behind closed doors. Ella, to her credit, stayed quiet through most of this. But something had shifted in her. One night, she came by alone. No Dylan. No warning. Just showed up at my office door holding a folder. "What's this?" I asked. "Tax records," she said. "From the past 2 years. Some of them don't add up." I stared at her. "Why are you bringing me this?" "Because I think he's doing things I don't know about," she said, her voice cracking slightly. I didn't say anything. She placed the folder on my desk and stepped back. "I just want to know what's real." I looked at her. Really looked at her. Tired eyes. Hollow cheeks. The same hands she used to dip into grape buckets when she was 10 now clenched into fists. "Then you'll have to decide," I said. "Which side of the vineyard you want to stand on." She left without answering. And I didn't follow her. Because she wasn't ready. But the moment was coming. The final piece of the setup fell into place when I received an invitation to an exclusive wine gala in Vienna. Invitation only. Private showcase. The kind of event Dylan would have given a kidney to attend. I'd been invited under my Coda alias, thanks to a few strings pulled by the sommelier in Paris. I RSVP'd, sent 2 cases ahead of me, and made a note to schedule a health retreat for the same weekend at a fake clinic 2 hours away. Then, I told Dylan I'd be leaving the estate for a few days. Said I needed rest. Said the doctors were concerned. And his eyes lit up just enough for me to notice. He didn't ask where I was going, because he was already planning what he'd do while I was gone. What he didn't know? Every call he made from the estate line was being monitored. Every meeting he scheduled that week was being recorded. Legally, of course, thanks to a new clause Agnes helped me slip into the employee conduct policy after he took temporary oversight. By the time I stepped on the plane to Vienna, the dominoes were lined up. The wine was ready. The players were in position. And Dylan? He was walking straight into a room with 100 hidden triggers. All it would take now was a single spark. I flew to Vienna under the name Mark Lemoyne, one of the many aliases I'd used in my younger days when entering underground wine competitions just for the thrill of it. The gala was held at Palais Niederösterreich, a grand hall with marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and the kind of chandeliers that reminded you power had taste. Inside, whispers floated from table to table, swirling with notes of plum and oak. Everyone was buzzing about one wine. Coda. They didn't know who made it, didn't know where it came from, but it was all they wanted to talk about. I watched from the far corner of the tasting hall, dressed in a black suit, no name tag, sipping my own creation as if I were just another curious guest. The first sip of Coda always hit slowly, fruity up front, then darker, with hints of ash and something people could never quite name. Some called it truth. Others said it tasted like closure. I liked that. That night, Coda won Best in Show. Unanimously. No one knew the man behind the wine had once been labeled a quaint old vintner, on the brink of handing over his life's work to a flashy son-in-law. And while I was making history in Vienna, Dylan was doing exactly what I knew he would. The moment I left for my retreat, he called an emergency meeting with a fake urgency he didn't even try to hide. Said the vineyard was in a precarious position and required immediate liquidity. He'd prepared documents, rushed, sloppily written, but dressed in enough legal jargon to fool anyone who wasn't looking closely. He was trying to sell the northern fields, the heart of the estate, the part that had belonged to my wife's family for 4 generations. And worse, he had a buyer, a commercial developer from out of state, someone he knew through real estate circles. They planned to bulldoze the vines and put up luxury condos. Dylan called it progress, but he made 2 mistakes. First, he underestimated the staff. The moment Javier got wind of the plan, he triggered the contingency I'd given him, a coded message buried in the irrigation logs that pinged Agnes, who immediately filed an injunction. Second, he didn't read the fine print, because those fields weren't just protected under land trust laws. They were also tied into my will through a living asset clause, one that couldn't be transferred, sold, or developed unless I was either dead or legally declared mentally incompetent. And I was very much alive, and, as it turns out, more competent than I'd ever been. By the time I landed back in the country, Dylan was already spiraling. He called me 4 times, left messages like, "Hey Ben, just some confusion here with the board. Call me back when you can. There seems to be some issue with the paperwork, nothing serious. I just need your signature." Okay, what is going on? I didn't respond. Instead, I scheduled a private board meeting for that Friday. No agenda, no explanation, just a date, a time, and one instruction: attendance mandatory. Friday came, and I walked into the estate's great hall, where we hosted the bigger meetings, and found them all waiting. Ella, Dylan, Agnes, the board, staff representatives, even Javier, who had swapped his usual vineyard boots for polished shoes and looked like he was ready to testify in front of the Supreme Court. I stood at the head of the table and pulled out a small stack of papers. "Before we begin," I said, calm as spring rain, "I'd like to share a story." Dylan smirked. He didn't know yet. "This story," I continued, "is about a man who thought legacy was something that could be stolen if the timing was right. That if you smiled long enough, dressed sharp enough, and played the waiting game, you could slip into someone else's throne while they were still sitting in it." The smirk began to fade. "But the man forgot something," I said, unfolding the first sheet. "He forgot who planted the vineyard, who built it vine by vine, who knows every route, every barrel, every vintage, down to the dust on the labels. I turned to Agnes. Would you mind reading that first section? She took the page and read aloud, a clause from the updated trust agreement. It revoked Dylan's access to all operations, financials, and decision-making powers retroactively. He hadn't been part of the leadership team for 2 months. Everything he thought he'd done? Legally null. Dylan's jaw tightened. You can't. Oh, but I can, I interrupted, handing Agnes the second page. It detailed the sale attempt of the northern fields. The forged paperwork. The emails, my staff had forwarded them all, proving he'd tried to override board policy using my name without consent. Illegal impersonation of a trustee, Agnes confirmed, clicking her pen. That carries consequences. And, I added, we're not done. I turned to Ella. You brought me tax records. She looked surprised but nodded. I checked them. You were right too. Dylan's been moving money. Small amounts, spread across dummy accounts tied to shell companies. Enough to slip under radar, but not mine. I clicked the remote in my hand. Behind me, a screen flickered to life. Dylan's face appeared, recorded on hidden camera footage from my office. He was on a call. Once the old man croaks, it's ours. I'll push the sale through within a week. He'll be too medicated to notice. The room went dead silent. Ella stared at him, her mouth slightly open. I didn't know about that, she whispered. I believed her. Dylan stood, trying to recover. That's taken out of context. Ben, come on. You're making this bigger than it. Sit down, I said. Not loud, but firm. And he did. Slowly. I turned to the board. Effective immediately, Dylan is permanently banned from the property. He is stripped of all roles, all influence, and all claims to the estate. I filed charges. Financial fraud, attempted theft, identity misrepresentation, and conspiracy to defraud a legal trust. Javier stepped forward and placed a sealed envelope in front of Dylan. Cease and desist, he said simply, and a restraining order. Dylan stood, furious now. This is absurd. You think you can just erase me? I stared at him. You were never written in. He stormed out, didn't even look at Ella, and she didn't follow him. Instead, she remained seated, still quiet. The board dispersed slowly. No one said much. I walked out to the vineyard, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the rows. And after a while, I heard footsteps behind me. Ella. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she asked, was this always the plan? No, I said. It was the contingency. I didn't know, she said softly. I know. She looked out across the fields. I messed up. Yes, I said. She nodded. Is it too late to fix it? I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw the girl who used to cry when we trimmed the vines, worried the plants would feel pain. Depends, I said. Are you here to inherit something? Or to build something? She didn't answer, but she stayed. And that was enough for now. Weeks passed. Dylan's trial moved forward, slowly but surely. Ella filed for separation. Quietly. No statements. No drama. She moved into the guest house. Said she needed time. I gave it to her. Coda sold out its first official run in under 12 hours. Nadia's Bistro became a pilgrimage site for wine lovers. The vineyard thrived. I held one final staff meeting that season. No suits. No agendas. Just wine, bread, cheese, and the people who made the place what it was. I stood up at the end, glass in hand, and said, here's to good roots. And even better pruning. They laughed, and we drank. The sun dipped low behind the hills. The vines swayed gently in the breeze. And I finally felt at peace. Not because I'd won, but because I'd never needed to. I just had to wait for them to reveal who they really were. Because in the end, the vineyard didn't belong to those who wanted to own it. It belonged to those who understood it. And as I walked the rows that night, hands brushing against the leaves, I whispered a final thought only the wind could hear.